he called me into his office and he's like, Dave, why are you putting butter in your coffee? What's wrong with you? I'm on a low fat diet, like you're a weird dude. And I sat him down and I told him why and how and what this stuff did long before they made an investment. And when they made the investment, Pete said, look, I never told Dave this, but 60 days after I started doing what he said, I went out to my car at the end of the day and I broke down into tears. Okay, this is not something you write about as a Silicon Valley VC. And he said the reason is that I had never told anyone this, and I never have. But my entire adult life, I've had crippling exhaustion, and I could barely make it through the day every day, but I wouldn't let it show. I never told anyone. He's a very successful VC, right? But he's like, I was pushing, and I was the same way. My accelerator was always pinned, and I could barely hold in there. And he goes, but the reason that I broke into tears, the whole day, I had energy that I had never had my whole life. And I just realized I went through the day without ever crashing. This is liberation. This is freedom. And that's why it's funny. You fast forward 5 or so years and everyone's fasting. Well, the first big book that had intermittent fasting as a part of it was called The Bulletproof Diet.
Welcome to the Maximus podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sepah. As a clinical psychologist, medical school professor, and CEO, I specialize in helping men be better in mind, body, and masculinity. On this podcast, I interview extraordinary men as a clinician would, hearing their come-up stories of how they became the men that they are today, and having them share their secrets of actionable advice on how to look, feel, and perform your best. Welcome to the Maximus podcast, everyone. On today's podcast, we have entrepreneur, published author, investor, and father of biohacking, Dave Asprey. Dave was the founder and chairman of Bulletproof, which focuses on how to help others become their best selves. He is a 3 times New York Times best-selling science author. 4 times.
Just hit the list with my new book last week.
There you go. Congratulations. And really excited to actually talk about that book. And you've been obviously featured on multiple television shows such as the Today Show, CNN, New York Times, Dr. Oz, and more. And interesting fun fact, you've spent $2 million or probably more by now taking control of your own biology, pushing the boundaries of human possibility in the name of science, evolution, and revolution. So Dave is also an investor and advisor for our company, Maximus. So really, really great to have you on today.
Thanks for having me on. I obviously like what you're doing, otherwise I wouldn't have written a check for it.
For sure. Well, that actually leads me to my very first question, which is I always, when I have investors on, love to ask them why they decided to invest in Maximus.
One of the things that was life-changing for me when I was about 26, I weighed 300 pounds, or at least I probably weighed 270 then, but I had weighed 300 pounds. I went to what today would be called a functional medicine doctor. There were not very many of these. And he said, I got your labs back, Dave. You have the testosterone levels. Let's say they're lower than your mom's. I sent my mom to the same guy. Wow. So my testosterone was not good. And I had, lots of other stuff going on as well. But I've been on testosterone most of the time since I was 26. And it has been absolutely life-changing to have healthy levels. And having worked with hundreds of the top anti-aging doctors and worked with so many women and so many men, it seems like after 40, it starts to go down. And one of the fundamental anti-aging things that I've written about in my earlier books is, look, do you want the hormone levels of a young person or an old person? Because you go to the doctor when you're 50 or 60 and they go, oh, your hormones are just fine. For a 60-year-old, because all 60-year-olds have crappy hormones. And you remember that movie Grumpy Old Men? It's really a documentary on testosterone deficiency. Like, that's how you act and feel when you don't have it. I had the benefit of that before I was 30, but it's also a pain to inject or rub cream on, and you got to make sure that the testosterone cream doesn't, get on sheets or get on kids or just stuff. So it's a pain. I've been doing it for 20 years. So the idea of saying, there's a way to optimize testosterone levels that's maybe way easier to do. To me, I like to invest in companies that are going to make life more powerful and better for people, not just make money, because ideally you do both. So this met all my criteria there.
Excellent. And yeah, thank you for sharing your personal story around that. I think that's, it's very, very powerful and compelling. And I think it makes a great point. We talk so much about menopause, obviously, for women, and don't talk enough about andropause, sort of the male relative equivalent of it. So I think, that's part of our job here, obviously, to educate more men that, testosterone levels can decline with age, typically about a rate of 1% per year. And so certainly as we get older, there's something that we should sort of test, monitor, and make sure that they're optimal. And unfortunately, we're also seeing this generational decline where even young men, particularly of this generation, have much lower testosterone levels than even their fathers and their grandfathers, which is quite worrisome as well. So for all of those reasons, I think it's helpful.
It is. And I see a lot of nutritional reasons for it. I see lifestyle reasons and stress reasons. And my very first book, going back to 2011, was on fertility. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about living to at least 180, which I've been really public about, I think that's actually something that people who are alive today are going to do, including me, unless a truck hits me or something.
Fingers crossed.
Exactly. At least if I'm getting hit by a truck, I hope it's a cyber truck. Those are kind of cool. You have to pick one. But you look at all this and go, we're going to live a long time. So people say, is there going to be a population issue? Mm-hmm. No, there isn't, because human fertility is dropping at a precipitous rate. And a big part of this is men, right? And part of it is low testosterone. And there's all kinds of variables here, but we've got to get on top of that. And bottom line is, if you want to be in a position to do something meaningful to fix that problem or fix any of the environmental problems or nutritional problems that we've created, you have to have enough energy and you have to care. And what people think of when they hear testosterone, it's still 1970s bodybuilders. Oh, roid rage and, injecting a bunch of weird chemicals. It's none of that stuff. Testosterone for men and women at different levels, obviously, it is the hormone of desire, but it's not desire in the bedroom only. It's a hormone of motivation. If you want to get your vibe back, I mean, tens of thousands of people over the years have shared their experiences of going on testosterone with me, just because of what I do with Bulletproof and all of the content that I make on my blog. And it's always about the mind. Right. And like, I got my vibe back. And yeah, of course, maybe I got leaner, maybe I got more muscles. But it's about relationships. It's about, I went to work and man, I just nailed it. And things like that. And that's the soft stuff. And if you're 28 and you're like I was, your testosterone's low, you don't know it. And maybe it's because you're eating tons of vegan, whatever processed food. Right. Maybe you're getting too much omega-6 or you're getting hormone disruptors in the air you breathe, which is a big problem. Absolutely. Then you don't know that the reason that you're struggling and you're not showing anyone, it's I'm low on testosterone or I'm low on some other hormones. And then you want to hide it. And it's a little bit of a shameful thing because you think that it's a willpower issue. But testosterone is a driver of willpower. It wasn't that you didn't have enough willpower. You didn't have enough chemicals to drive the willpower so you can go do what you wanted to do anyway. So it's deeply frustrating to be in that. Like, I know I've got more, but when I'm pushing the accelerator down, it's already on the floor and I can push harder, but I'm slowing down. And then you wake up in the morning, like, I just don't care that much. Like, I know I want to care, but I don't. Getting your testosterone back fixes that problem in a way that's very hard to put words to. That's why it matters. All the other abs and muscles and, bedroom stuff, those are side benefits from my perspective.
Yeah. And I fully agree with you. I think, people, maybe it's because it's the easiest thing to see the increasingly lean muscle mass and decrease in body fat, which is obviously a great benefit in terms of body recomposition. But as a psychologist and psychiatry professor, I think the psychological benefits are underappreciated, right? So certainly in terms of, energy, drive, motivation, confidence. Interestingly, there's even research showing TRT actually makes people friendlier. So it's actually completely counter to the sort of roid rage stereotype. There's a improvement in mood and relatability that comes with testosterone, which kind of makes sense. If your hormone levels are optimal, you're kind of feeling like a little bit of an alpha male. You have a genuine sense of confidence and security, and so it doesn't kind of act that you don't need to act out as much. I think, in fact, some of the moodiness that you see from people is probably from low testosterone, unfortunately, these days.
It is. And people oftentimes make this mistake with any hormone. Like it's either a good one or a bad one. And take cortisol. It's the stress hormone. It's bad. People who are low cortisol hate their life. And people who are high cortisol hate their life and lose their hair and their erections. So there's a zone where it ought to be. And testosterone is the same way. And the zone is different for men and women. But for men, if your testosterone's high, you might get a little bit aggressive, but not like you would think. And if it's low, you're bitchy, for lack of a better word. Like life isn't good. Like, I don't know, everything sucks and I just don't feel motivated. And when it's in the Goldilocks zone, which oftentimes is just a little bump, then all of a sudden like, oh, things are flowing in life. And man, how do you quantify that? I don't know, but I've definitely gone off testosterone multiple times. Mostly when I was testing out the bulletproof diet, say, all right, can I raise my testosterone? Sure. And what I found was, went off for 2 or 3 years. If I carefully monitored my sleep, I carefully monitored my nutrition, and I did everything right, I could get to basically the 50th percentile. But keep in mind, I've had low testosterone for, pretty much most of my adult life because of some genetics and because of some environmental stuff. So, and also because I was obese. And the more white fat cells you have, the more estrogen you make, the faster you convert testosterone into estrogen. So for me, this is one of those incredibly powerful biohacks that lets me show up in life. And I know what it's like to be off testosterone. And if you're not sleeping well, you're not managing things, you're not doing intermittent fasting, you're not eating enough of the right saturated fats and all these crazy things, you're probably going to be low. And I'm like, anyone over 40, you should at least get a hormone test. And you should start addressing this, because if you want to be 140 and still showing up as yourself, having enough testosterone makes your brain work better. It actually is an anti-aging hormone, but you don't need to have the levels of, a 16-year-old going through puberty either. It's not necessary and it's not beneficial. And that's why I think Maximus is a really cool thing. And if you don't have to inject or rub creams and just manage all of that, this is a much easier approach, which, hey, like that's awesome. It helps everybody.
For sure. Yeah. And that's one of the things we were interested in is how do you take, the revolutionary benefits that you're mentioning to the masses and also to a younger audience, and including an under 40 audience in a way that's obviously safe and effective and maintains fertility, which is, really important.
Maintaining fertility is important, but there's something else happening during the coronavirus that is a real thing. And I've talked about it on Bulletproof Radio with a couple different guests who are experts in evolutionary biology. And it's interesting, in cities, we've gone to this thing where we remove all the female trees. And it's because they make seeds that you have to sweep up. So all you have is male trees everywhere. And they put out way more pollen when you do that, because the presence of women, fertile women, around men drives testosterone. Well, if you are socially isolated, or you're socially isolated even with women, but they're on birth control pills that drop their pheromones very much, your body is getting a signal that there are no women around here, and your testosterone levels drop. It's an environmental signal. And if you want to know, why does that guy want to live in his grandmother's basement and play video games all the time? Part of that is low testosterone, and part of that is low testosterone because he actually isn't exposed to people he's attracted to who are hormonally signaling, hey, like maybe you should have some testosterone present so you could use it. So we're sending ourselves a signal during the pandemic by, never coming near anyone and all that, that's going to drop testosterone for everyone. And I think looking at your levels, whatever your age is, if you're like, I'm just feeling depressed, dude, testosterone fixes depression in men and women. It's ridiculous. It doesn't fix all types of depression. I mean, you're better trained in that than I am. But how many times have you seen a patient who went on testosterone and suddenly didn't feel anxiety and depression the way they did before?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. That's fascinating. Yeah. And I don't think people, unfortunately, think about the environmental factors, as much. Unfortunately, they're a little bit harder to change, given our environment and society. But I do think there is a lot that we can do, both with lifestyle supplementation, medication, that can at least help, buttress, some of that, or help us, better regulate these sort of xenoestrogens or endocrine disrupting chemicals that I know you've talked and written a lot about. So I just want to back up for a second, because I definitely want to deep dive into testosterone and all the ways that we can measure and improve it. But one of the things that we try to do on the podcast is kind of break it up into two parts. And the first part is what we call making the man, to get a little bit of a background and biography on folks to understand how they got to the successful place that they are today, which I assume a lot of our listeners would love to hear. So I'd love to just kind of get the backstory on Dave Asprey, and kind of hear a little bit about how you became the Bulletproof executive. So why don't we just start a little bit in terms of like, where did you grow up? What was that like for you?
I grew up in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I didn't know it at the time, but the basement that I lived in, a nice house, had been flooded before I bought the house. And my bedroom was full of toxic black mold, which makes xenoestrogens 1,000 times stronger than normal estrogen. So every time when I'd go to sleep there, this was an endocrine disruption experience. So I had the benefits of that as a teenager, and all sorts of strange medical effects that come from that. But one of them was low testosterone. And many of the others are obesity, stretch marks when I was a teenager, arthritis as a teenager, and just all kinds of things, to the point that by the time I was 30, I had all the diseases of aging you'd expect. So arthritis, prediabetes, high risk of stroke and heart attack on lab tests, cognitive dysfunction that you would get more in your 60s or 70s if you didn't take care of yourself, and just a whole host of problems, a lot of stress that was actually environmentally induced stress. And it was not a good place to be. At the same time, though, I was a co-founder of a part of the company that held Google's first servers when it was 2 guys in a server. And this company, it was called Exodus Communications, became worth $36 billion on the NASDAQ. And I made $6 million when I was 26. So I'm sitting in these meetings. I have struggled with my weight. I've struggled with my energy. And I'm sitting in these incredibly powerful things. I was actually allowed to attend board meetings in my 20s. I couldn't speak, but I could sit there and take notes and just learn. Right. And it was such an exciting time. So my cognitive parts of my brain are like, this is the coolest thing ever. And I'm here where, the Facebook is coming in with a couple servers, and, every company you've heard of that's worth many billions of dollars that was around in the late 90s, we were where they planted their seeds. And it was the most amazing time, but I'm exhausted. I can't remember what's going on in meetings. And I'm thinking I wouldn't hire myself because I know I'm smarter than this, but I can't remember. What's the word for that? Why am I not seeing that? And so you get this feeling of helplessness, and you think maybe it's because I'm not trying hard enough. So then you stay up later and you push harder, but you're blown out. And when this happens, universally, you get low testosterone. I also, along the way, said, well, I'm going to solve this weight problem. I'll just work out 6 days a week, hour and a half a day. And I'll do half weights, half cardio. I'll go on a low fat, low calorie diet. So 18 months later of this, you think I walked out with abs. No, I still was a size 46-inch waist. I still weighed 300 pounds. I could max out all the machines. Did I likely lower my testosterone by doing that? Yeah, I was way overtrained, which lowers testosterone. Stress, emotional stress, environmental stress, financial stress, all of those are testosterone suppressors when you have too many of them. And when you stack them all up, even fasting, which is the new book, if you overfast, your testosterone will drop. If you underfast, your testosterone will drop. So it's all about getting the right level. So that $6 million, though, was a gift. Unfortunately, I lost it 2 years after I made it, which is a little bit stressful and probably also dropped my testosterone. But for sure. What I found during that time was the most important thing of all was my energy. And it wasn't money, because I even before that company, I sold the first thing ever sold over the internet in my early 20s. It was a t-shirt that said caffeine, my drug of choice. The name e-commerce hadn't been invented yet. A company called the Meta Group wrote the first white paper on e-commerce. I know because I was in the room when we wrote it. And this was a world-changing time. So I'd had my moments of fame. I'm an Entrepreneur Magazine in my 20s, woohoo, here's my fat picture. Right. And then I had my moment of wealth that came and went, and neither one made me happy. And I was so tired. And I said, all right, the most important thing is energy. I'm going to put all of my money, all my time into getting my energy back and not worry so much about the weight. And it turns out when you get energy back, your weight will naturally self-regulate. And it led me on this path of biohacking, where I spent north of $1 million, probably a couple million at this point, on first recovering my biology and then upgrading my biology, getting younger, living longer, making my brain way better now than it's ever been in my entire life, where I don't drop words, I don't forget things. I can do things that I never would have dreamed possible in my 20s or 30s. And usually your brain slows down. I believe that by managing my hormones, this whole process of biohacking, which is a field that I created, where you're saying the definition I wrote when I first was doing the conferences for this, it's the art and science of changing the environment around you and inside of you so that you have full control of your own biology. Like we all want to dial in. Oh, I wanted to be motivated about the things I wanted to be motivated about. I wanted unlimited energy. I want to look a certain way. And maybe you're like, I want to get swole, or maybe your goal is I want to be the fastest or the smartest, or whatever. I want to be a talented pianist. It doesn't really matter, but it's about control. Will my body have what it takes when I ask for it? Either it does or it doesn't. And that unites neuroscience and functional medicine and Navy SEALs and astronauts and bodybuilders, all the different people who are out there doing little stovepipes, little pillars of this to unite them into, hey, it's systems biology. I was a computer hacker. That was my training. And what you do when you're trying to hack a system is you say, okay, I don't know what's in there, but I know what the outside looks like. So I'm going to keep doing stuff and see how it changes. And the idea is you can have control without knowing everything. And we don't know much about what's going on in the body. We know more now than we ever have, but there's a lot we don't know. We're finding more every day. So the hacking approach is saying, I don't have to know, but I know if I do this and I reliably get this, then something magic has happened. And now I got the results I wanted. And I started applying that. And I spent as much of that 6 million as I could on anything that might work and started getting the data. And I committed myself to, I'm going to do what works. I'm not going to do what's supposed to work. I'll try what's supposed to work. And if it works, but I'm going to measure it. And I had a deep distrust of medicine that I still have. Some certain types of thinking in medicine are just horrible and wrong. But there's a lot of doctors, a lot of them now, who are becoming systems biologists and saying, oh, it's more than one variable. It's not just one drug. It's not just one thing. It's how did you sleep? How do you move? How do you eat? When do you eat? And so for me to be able to kind of light that fire, I've held conferences for 9 years, the biohacking conference, written lots of books on it. But for me, it was just, I wanted control of my own biology. I didn't want to be fat. I didn't want my knees to hurt. I didn't want to be tired. And I didn't want to act like a jerk all the time. And those are big problems that I was dealing with.
For sure. Yeah. We always say research is me search. And so it sounds like unfortunately came out of some of those negative health experiences that you had early on. But it's such a great example of sort of sublimation, as we talk about in psychology, right? That you took all those negative experiences and you channeled it positively to not only improving your own health, but obviously the health of a very large community that you've built, to your credit, around you, who, I think now biohacking is almost like a common word that I hear around. It was actually interesting. We obviously met through Trinity Ventures when I was working with Dan Skolnick over there and was an investor in Bulletproof. And it was really fun for me to kind of see the evolution and growth of your company. When I'd walk into a random Whole Foods, anywhere in the US, to see, Bulletproof on the menu, literally, and available to literally everyone in the world, I think really kind of mainstreamed biohacking. It wasn't just a niche thing for, like the bodybuilders and Navy SEALs that you mentioned, but, for everyone, I think, even if they don't necessarily label themselves as a biohacker, I think most people want to look, feel, and perform their best within whatever, profession, occupation, or even personal, goals that they have. So kudos on that. I'm particularly also curious though, you kind of are telling the story of, your early years as a tech executive. How did you kind of go from being this sort of tech executive to the bulletproof executive? Sure. So I want to hear that part of the story.
I was thinking, where can I get knowledge that's going to help me on this path of upgrading my biology? Because, I don't know how to do it. And I found an anti-aging nonprofit group, one of the first ones that had been started in the early 90s. And I started going to these meetings a couple of minutes off Stanford's campus, about 3 minutes from Google's headquarters. And pretty soon they asked me to be president of this thing. And everyone there was, 60, 70, 80. One of my board members was almost 90. I'm like, these guys are 2 and 3 times my age, but man, they know. And the experts we'd have come in were teaching me stuff that worked. And I realized very early on, this is about mitochondrial biology. How do your cells make energy? And So I was blessed to learn from all these people. And then I sat down and I said, I've been at a string of successful network engineering kind of companies. And I worked at Trinity Ventures as an entrepreneur in residence, a venture firm that had backed one of the other companies where I'd been. And I became the CTO and co-founder of one of the companies that had a fitness tracker. We sold it to Intel for $100 million. And I really got into biomonitoring and saying, all right, how do I get all this data to know that what I'm doing is working? And along the way, I said, I've spent enough time in the nonprofit field. I'm just going to write a blog. And I'm going to call it the Bulletproof Executive, because no one's ever written a blog for me, for the stuff that I care about as an entrepreneur. It's always about like, do you want to be a weekend warrior, run a marathon? So I'm like, no, the marathon I want to do is writing code. Thank you very much. And I just realized like no one has thought about this in terms of controlling yourself. It's like, do you want to be healthy? And look, if you're 30, you know what you want? You do not want to be healthy. It's number 17 on your honey-do list. You want two things. You want to get laid, at least if your testosterone's high enough, and you want to grow your career in your community. These are much higher biological priorities set by your meat. They're not even set by you. And that is what you're supposed to be doing, right? So I stopped talking about health and I started talking about how do you feel, how do you perform, how do you show up? And it turns out health helps you with that. But I don't know, do you wake up in the morning saying, today I hope I'm healthy?
Right. Yeah.
I don't think you do.
Really. Yeah.
No, it's like on your list of priorities, but it's never near the top. And today, do I want to be powerful and have fun? I'll sign up for that. So I changed the language around health, and it turns out hacking your health, upgrading yourself, like that stuff has become common culture. But I do believe it's reasonable to say I can take credit for that. But I wrote this blog thinking 5 people are going to read it. And I wanted to find 5 people who were like I was, just wrecked. And if I could save them spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of suffering, that the karma points for doing that, just like the ROI, even if I spend 1,000 hours writing on that, to just never let someone go through what I went through was worth it. The blog was called The Bulletproof Executive. And then I had recognized that there was a problem with coffee, where coffee has mold in it. Mold is a xenoestrogen quite often. And mold disrupts human performance. And there's a whole bunch of international regulatory reasons that the US gets the world's dirtiest coffee. And it was messing with me. I drink coffee and I feel bad, and I drink other coffee and I feel good. So I'm going to solve this problem for me. The market size for clean coffee was 0. So I put a thing out on my little blog saying, hey, anyone else want to try some coffee? Like, help me with lab testing and all. I'm going to figure this out. And it turns out there was a lot more interest than just 5 people reading the blog, and people wanted the coffee. And I changed the blog's name eventually to just Bulletproof. And now I do my blogging on daveasprey.com, and Bulletproof is a larger company where Bulletproof writes mostly about coffee and collagen and basic nutritional stuff, which is awesome. And along the way, that happened where I sat down and I went and actually met with Dan, our mutual friend, who was at Trinity Ventures. And I said, hey, Dan, you've known me for a long time, and Bulletproof has been really impactful for you, the Bulletproof diet. I don't need venture funding. I've sat in your partner meetings. No VCs will ever invest in this company because I'm in 5 different categories, 3 of which I created: collagen, MCT, and clean coffee. And you could maybe argue collagen bars too. But like, you're supposed to invest in companies that are in only one market. And I know that I'm doing it wrong, but this is stuff that matters for human performance. I'm going to do it. And I said, so give me $50,000 to buy coffee inventory personally, because this will never be a Trinity investment. And they came back the next week and said, Dave, how about we give you $8 million? And I'm like, whoa. And I had this little conversation with myself. It's like, okay, if you take venture money, it implies that at some point the company is going to go public or merge or do something big, and you lose some control. But it gave me the momentum to help millions of people. Before that, when I started with the blog, it took off in Silicon Valley, and there's all these engineers going, oh my God, my brain works better. This is awesome. And then it went over to Wall Street, where it's like, I have to have my brain working and I never want to sleep. And then it went to Hollywood and professional sports and the music industry, where, Rick Rubin suddenly in the New York Times saying, oh, I drink Bulletproof coffee. I'm like, holy crap. Like the music producer who's like made every song I ever loved. Like, how's this even possible? It spread because these are the type of areas where these are the people who needed the most cognitive function, and they were willing to change their lifestyle to make their brains work better. And all of them, of course, want to, look good. And especially in Hollywood, like I don't know how to look good and stay lean and have my brain work, because if you can't remember your lines and you have dark circles, crap. So there's all these variables, and it's gotten to the point now where, the highest performing people in the world use Bulletproof Coffee on a regular basis. It's at Everest Base Camp. Nick Foles wrote about it in his memoir for winning the Super Bowl. And he mentioned it 6 times. I didn't pay any of these people to mention it. It's been on Jimmy Fallon with Shailene Woodley talking about it. Jim Carrey spilled Bulletproof Coffee on a major TV talk show thing and licked it off the table on camera. Like, I've never met Jim Carrey. I'd love to someday, but like, holy crap, right? But this is the idea of a product that works, that makes people feel better. And by the way, that's also part of why I invested in Maximus, because I think when people try what you've got, they're going to have similar effects where like, oh my God, I got it back. And that's how I got to do it. It was literally a blog that was not meant to be a business. It was meant to share knowledge that was precious and life-saving and suffering reducing. And it just became a company because how could I not do that?
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, I think that's such a great lesson for our listeners, right? A lot of folks who follow us are entrepreneurs, or they're thinking about becoming entrepreneurs, maybe starting their next business. And they're always thinking, what's the next big thing? What's the next big trend? What's the hottest sector? Which is not a necessarily a bad approach to starting a business. But I think for some folks, understanding really what their passion and strengths are, almost going down the rabbit hole of that and seeing what kind of emerges is a great way sometimes of starting a business. And I actually had a very similar experience. I was an EIR at Trinity. While I was there, even though I was supposed to be an entrepreneur in residence, which is typically, implies that you're starting a next company, I told them, look, I'm coming off my second company. I don't want to start a third company. I just want to hang out. I want to help you guys invest in health tech and kind of figure out what I want to do next. And they're like, that's fine, no pressure. But I actually going down the rabbit hole of sort of, biohacking, my own self with the hormones and other stuff, to optimize my own biology, kind of fell in love with the field and just realized like, this is a huge problem to be solved. And couldn't help but, start this company. So I had no intention of doing it. And in a lot of ways, I think, drew inspiration from you in terms of, writing first. I was writing kind of about masculinity, writing a lot on social media, kind of accidentally developing an audience. Again, it wasn't my intention. I was just writing about the things that I cared about. And people were like, things like dopamine fasting obviously blew up in August of last year all around the world. And I was like, yeah, this is an interesting opportunity to maybe turn this into something bigger. So yeah, maybe great lesson there for people who are looking for their next big thing is, solve the problems that you can relate to yourself, and that you care deeply about and want to work on for the next 10 years.
Thank you for sharing that. Bulletproof won an award from Forbes as one of the top 20 most innovative companies. And like, we did create multiple $100 million categories in grocery. But it was just because you can't buy MCT oil. Like it was an unknown thing, and you couldn't get grass-fed collagen protein. It was an unknown thing. And now they're, all over the place. And, there's billions of dollars of value created even outside of Bulletproof, just by creating change in the world. And I would offer for your entrepreneurs who are listening, there's 2 kinds of entrepreneurs. I'm going to call them, actually maybe 3 kinds. We'll go with 3. There's entrepreneurs. They think they should be an entrepreneur because it's cool, but they don't have it in them. Right. And you're sort of like, well, this is what all the cool kids are doing. I'm going to do it, but I don't feel like the deep drive to do it. You probably should be helping an entrepreneur. So you're entrepreneurial, but you're not actually cut out for that. And there's nothing good or bad. In fact, being an entrepreneur is kind of a painful thing, to be honest. You have to be willing to self-flagellate sometimes. But then there's 2 other kinds. The next person who has the ability to, build and run a company, but they don't have the creative visionary side of things. And what they're going to do is they're going to become a parasite entrepreneur, and they're going to find someone else's idea, and they're going to cheapen it and copy it and then put it on the market and say, I'm going to make money. And you're not improving the world that way. And that's the behavior. That's why if you go to Amazon today, it's like going to a swap meet 20 years ago. It's like everything is made out of cheap plastic, and it's always about how can I have the cheapest crap that falls apart in 6 months after I buy it. And it's frustrating. But if you're the other kind, the kind that says, I'm going to do something better or different than has ever been done before, then you actually improve and you evolve the world. And I'd say, look, it's the same amount of work to do either one. except not really. It's less work to do the thing that changes the world, because then you're constantly motivated and it pulls you. But if you're saying, I'm going to, knock off this other thing I saw, and I think I can, replace the metal with some cheap plastic and, put in low quality ingredients and swap out collagen for milk protein isolate because it's cheap, and just not even care and just be like, I'm just going to build a brand. That's what big food did. It's like, oh, here's how we think. How cheap is it? How good can we make it taste? And can we put a pretty sticker on it? If so, it's a product. And that has led to low testosterone, obesity, all sorts of health problems. 42% of people are fat. We don't want to build that world. And you're going to build a world as an entrepreneur. So build the world you want instead of a cheap, shitty world. And if we could just get more entrepreneurs on that path, we'll make all kinds of cool stuff that no big company will ever make. And then we'll become big companies. And I learned that in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, those are great explanation of sort of the three archetypes, and certainly hopefully it will inspire people to push more on the innovative side. I'm particularly interested, since you mentioned different types of entrepreneurs. In your sort of journey to becoming from the Bulletproof executive, the blog writer, to the CEO and founder of Bulletproof. I'm curious if you had any particular role models. Whether, in your personal life, family life, or role models as entrepreneurs that kind of inspired you to kind of, go to the next level and obviously, run a very large company, manage a lot of people, and be, a very public entrepreneur.
That's a really good question. Coming up in Silicon Valley, a lot of people, you don't see a lot of what happens there. It's an insular community, but it's very competitive. It's one of the highest performing places on the planet when you're talking about building these companies. So a lot of the things that I learned, people say, oh, wow, you came out of nowhere and you were instantly successful. Like, no, I spent almost 20 years working at these startups, pushing the broom, doing my best, but learning from executives, some of whom I greatly respected and some of whom I'm like, I don't want to be that kind of executive. And so a lot of how I learned to do what I do came from those experiences. And I'm thinking back. I worked for a company called Netscaler that was acquired by Citrix for hundreds of millions of dollars. The CEO there, BV Jagdish, was this profoundly amazing guy. And he did yoga every morning for 30 something years. And he was just always calm, always fair, and always kind. And that was almost the opposite of what you'd see in a lot of Silicon Valley companies, where you'd see, you see like this kind of arrogant, aggressive sort of thing. And he didn't have to do that to build a successful company. He was competitive, but it was making things win-win for people. And I just remember the difference between that and some of the other execs I worked for who were angry and ego-driven and all that. I'm like, I want more of that. And so he was an example of that. Another guy named Peter Fortenbaugh, who made a lot of money at that Exodus company, and to this day runs the Boys and Girls Club in East Palo Alto. Like, he's like, I have what I need. I'm going to give back for the rest of my life, and is profoundly happy doing it. So those are two of the guys in my career that really just stand out as like, wow, really admirable. But it was more the energy that they would bring to a team, and the calmness, and the not panicking, and the mission driven part of it. So when I worked on building the culture at Bulletproof early, I looked for those things, and we have our mission and vision and values about making the world a better place. And then over time, there's very few entrepreneurs who grow companies at 25 million or something who are profoundly good at running $100 million companies. And I'll tell you, that's why I have a CEO working for Bulletproof now. I'm chairman and founder, but it is incredibly boring to run a $100 million company. It's terrible. It's like all spreadsheets and stuff. And there are people way better suited for that. It's a different kind of brain than mine.
Fair enough. Yeah. And I love, by the way, in the examples that you gave, you cited a CEO that was not just successful, but health oriented and doing yoga every single morning. Was kind, which is not sort of a prototypical CEO trait that you hear, at least according to sort of the Steve Jobsian kind of archetype or stereotype, perhaps, that Silicon Valley gets painted a brush with. And also sort of very philanthropic / charitable, right? With the other example that you mentioned. It's such an important thing, I think, actually, for people to hear these sort of contrarian examples. It kind of reminds me, actually, on Twitter, I had a tweet go viral where I was talking about, if you do want to be the CEO, the best place to start is to be the CEO of you, which is, you need to sort of exercise leadership over yourself and take care of your diet and your exercise and your sleep and your relationships and your focus. And it was kind of funny. Most people obviously, responded very positively, a lot of likes and retweets, but a lot of people were like, what CEOs actually do this? This is totally unrealistic. And I was like, well, you should go talk to more CEOs. Yes, there's the stereotype of the sleep deprived, hard driving, CEO, but I certainly know a lot of CEOs who really do actually take care of themselves. And my whole thesis is CEOs that do prioritize their health, their performance, and their relationship with their company and their personal relationships do perform better. It's strange to me that's even a controversial idea in Silicon Valley, but I'm 37 now.
Got it. So I'm 48. So I've got about, 12 years on you. So only 10 years before you came into the CEO thing, the typical CEO drank and was fat and would make fun of you if you did yoga or took vitamins or meditated. In fact, one of the things I did early on in my career is I put in my LinkedIn profile, yoga, meditation, and modafinil, which is the limitless drug. And I was, the reason modafinil is part of biohacking is I was on ABC Nightline a while ago. I was like the only guy to say, I use this performance enhancing cognitive drug to get through Wharton, and I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't used it for 8 years. I don't need it anymore because my brain works better than it ever has. But even doing that, what I found was most people would roll their eyes, but in Silicon Valley, you can be a weird maverick. And I was always the weird maverick, even in Silicon Valley, just because, I don't know, I am what I am. And they, after those meetings though, like maybe 1 in 10 people be like, hey, I saw you on LinkedIn. You mentioned meditation. Like I actually have a meditation practice. And I went to this weird, in Berkeley, this weird, like it was a 5 rhythms drumming, dancing thing that no sane CEO would ever go to. And the lady in the middle playing the drum, I'm like, what do you do? She's like, oh, I'm CFO for a major company. I'm like, wait a minute. So there's always been an undercurrent of high performing executives who do meditate, who do take care of themselves, who do stuff. Even Steve Jobs, granted, his diet probably causes pancreatic cancer, but he cared about his diet and did his best to control it. And those kinds of things, they were there, but it was a shameful thing. And part of what I want to do with biohacking is like, guys, this is what all the people who kick the most ass do. Let's just raise our hands and say that we do it. And it can actually be cool. And I think it is cool now. And if you look at the average, like look at what Jeff Bezos looks like and Zuckerberg and most of the other CEOs now, they actually have relatively lean bodies compared to all CEOs throughout all of human history. And their energy is better. I think most of them are on testosterone. To be perfectly honest, because they're getting proper functional medicine care. And so now, okay, you're going to show up at a race with someone else, and business is a competition at some levels. And do you want to be the person who can't make enough energy and just trying to do it, or do you want to be the person whose biology is wired to make more energy? And that's what led me to write my books, and especially this latest one. I look at everything that I do through the lens of ROI, return on investment, but you don't actually invest dollars when you're talking about your health, you invest energy. So how much energy do you invest on something and how much energy do you get back? And even as an entrepreneur, the stuff I do on my day-to-day work, if it's something that takes me energy, like if I spend energy and I don't get any back, I hire someone who gets energy from doing that. I don't want to do that stuff because that's a drain. But everything you put on your plate, the time you eat and all that stuff, okay, you put something in, you got something out. I picked fasting for this book because it's the highest ROI activity there is for improving performance. For the simple fact that if you were going to spend some amount of energy, some amount of time, and some amount of money on making breakfast, and you don't have to do that, it's like you walk into the bank and you don't have an account there. And the teller's like, oh, hi, here's some money. They pay you up front. They go, I'll give you interest later today. And that interest comes in the form of less cravings and more energy than when you had breakfast. So you're like, oh, I got interest on money I didn't deposit. That's interesting. They go, oh, come back in a year or two and we'll give you another check. And that's the long term. Oh, now I'm not insulin resistant. Now I don't get diabetes. I have more energy. I'm leaner. I feel better. My hormones are more regulated. Like everything good happens. So this is the easiest thing to do, except the cognitive and the psychology parts of it make it seem unattainable. And I've used intermittent fasting in the Bulletproof diet, which has helped people lose 1 million pounds for 10 years. So I know why people don't do it. I know the practicalities of implementing it for a decade and things like that. I thought this is worth a book because it's really easy to say, here's my book on fasting. Step 1, don't eat for a while. Step 2, it's good for you. Here's some studies. But knowing it's good for you doesn't make you do it. It's how do you actually do it, and how do you do it without pain? Because I don't believe in suffering more than is necessary. In fact, most human progress is born from laziness and desire to not suffer. So I'll support those noble goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, we talk about this in psychology all the time in terms of rolling with people's resistance. If the activation energy is too high for getting people to do things, or at least the perception of it, that it's too difficult, then yeah, you have an uphill struggle. So it's nice to see though, fasting kind of enter the mainstream consciousness as not just a extreme or eccentric kind of behavior, but in fact something, at least I would argue in Silicon Valley circles, almost has become the norm for a while. I think, when I was at Trinity, I was like, who's not fasting at the office whenever we'd order lunch, because I was like, I don't think anyone's eating here. Now obviously that's kind of maybe a non-representative sample of people, but it just goes to show that, people who are interested in performance are more likely to, adopt these things and actually find that they're easier to do than it seems.
Yeah. If you'd been in that Trinity office 5 or 6 years earlier when I was doing intermittent fasting, I actually was in the kitchen break room, and I was trying to heat up a mug of bulletproof coffee with a butane torch. Don't ask me why. And I shattered the mug because it wasn't heat resistant. I'm like, God, good thing none of the partners saw me do that. There's like coffee on the ceiling with butter in it. Oh, no. But then when they invested in Bulletproof, Dan, our mutual friend, wrote a piece on Medium. And I didn't know this about me. And we're very close friends. And he said that he called me into his office and he's like, Dave, why are you putting butter in your coffee? What's wrong with you? I'm on a low fat diet, like you're a weird dude. And I sat him down and I told him why and how and what this stuff did long before they made an investment. And when they made the investment, his piece said, look, I never told Dave this, but 60 days after I started doing what he said, I went out to my car at the end of the day and I broke down into tears. Okay, this is not something you write about as a Silicon Valley VC. And he said the reason is that I had never told anyone this, and I never have. But my entire adult life, I've had crippling exhaustion, and I could barely make it through the day every day. But I wouldn't let it show. I never told anyone. He's a very successful VC, right? But he's like, I was pushing, and I was the same way. My accelerator was always pinned, and I could barely hold in there. And he goes, but the reason that I broke into tears, the whole day I had energy that I had never had my whole life. And I just realized I went through the day without ever crashing. This is liberation. This is freedom. And that's why it's funny. You fast forward 5 or so years and everyone's fasting. Well, the first big book that had intermittent fasting as a part of it was called The Bulletproof Diet. And so it's one of many things that's in the book, but the fact that it's happening in Silicon Valley and it's happening, in fact, they've even invested in a fasting company, which is cool. And as you look at creating change, it's finding what works, and it has to work so well that people know that the activation energy is worth it, and they have to see someone else do it. And that was why I'm like, all right, I'm going to write Fast This Way, because the activation energy is way lower than anyone thinks it is. And just walk them through it. And then there's 3 hacks that are in the book that are scientifically valid, that anger the people who say you can only have water when you fast. Those people are wrong. And what you end up with is you say, oh, I can actually have a negative activation energy where I actually get more energy doing it than not. So it's a painless thing that pays a lot of dividends for health. Even if you don't want to go on the bulletproof diet, even if you eat whatever you eat, just eat it at the right time and skip it for a while. Magic happens in your biology, and it's very manageable.
For sure. Yeah. In fact, it kind of reminds me of this thesis that I'm currently on, that I call trad humanism, which is kind of a play on transhumanism. That I think a lot of human progress is about sort of taking things that are traditional, which kind of can be like yak butter tea, which in some ways, at least the butter part of it, inspired bulletproof coffee. But then you combine it with technology, right? Which now we have access to highly refined MCT oils, right? Where you get more of the bang for your buck from the C8, caprylic acid that makes it even more effective than even these sort of traditional versions. And so you get this interesting blend of tradition and technology, and you combine, lots of ancient wisdom that has worked well, and, provided energy to shepherds in traditional society for thousands of years, but with the benefit of modern technology that really takes it to the next level. So it can help whether you're an executive VC or, just a mom trying to get through their day, to be more effective. So it's such a great example of that thesis, and I think that's part of the reason why it's become as popular as it has today.
It's actually really interesting. The more monitoring we do, the more we prove ancient wisdom. So we grow up going, oh, we're Western science minded, and you would never do acupuncture because it can't work, therefore it doesn't. And the it can't work, therefore it doesn't is one of the cognitive errors that people make, especially in science. And it's why, you take Galileo and you got to burn him at the stake because that can't be true. Therefore, it isn't. Therefore, you're a liar and a bad person, blah, blah, blah. And I dealt with a lot of that in the early years of Bulletproof. But at this point, keto's kind of got some science behind it, and fasting kind of has some science behind it. And not eating omega-6 oils has some science behind it. And all these things, it takes time. But people get really mad when you say don't eat because it triggers some really core psychology stuff. And that's part of what I wrote about in the book. When I first, even before I wrote the Bulletproof Diet, before I even started blogging, I recognized that I had a fear of being hungry. And I said, okay, I know that if I don't eat 6 times a day, I'll go into starvation mode and then I'll get fatter, because that's what it said in Reader's Digest when I was a teenager. Like, people believe this stuff. And I also knew that if I didn't eat, I would get hypoglycemia. So I was already kind of a jerk, but man, if you don't feed me, I am a real jerk. Right. And so I'm like, I don't want to be mean, and I don't want to be fat. So if I don't eat it, it's threatening. And I also knew that I ate when I was lonely. So I said, all right, I got to face this stuff. So I hired a shaman to drop me off in the desert in Sedona, in a cave for 4 days with no people and no food. And I said, all right, then if I get hypoglycemia, well, I can yell at the cave and I can just deal with loneliness and wanting to eat and kind of push all my buttons at one time. And that's kind of how I roll. I'm like, oh, if I know I have an issue there, I'm going to find a way to work on that issue and just dive deep and understand my psychology and why I do what I do and how to improve it. So that experience was really instructional in the idea that you can have a spiritual fast. But to try to do a spiritual fasting technique, which requires rest and reflection, on Monday morning, when you have 2 kids jumping up and down and you're trying to focus on Zoom and you're not used to fasting, you're going to fail. And the activation energy is way too high. And if you do it, you're going to be so tired and so hypoglycemic, hangry, that it's just not going to be a good experience. Well, there's hacks for that. And it's okay to say, I wanted it to be easier. And I'm, as far as I know, the first guy to say, hurry, meditate faster. Like, I have a whole neuroscience company that does that. And the deal is, how much time do you have to put into improving yourself? How much energy do you have, and how do you get it back? And I think fasting is necessary. If people, not every day, not over fasting, it's different for men and women, but it's such a cheap and easy and incredibly powerful technique that if we just turn that on, our death rate from all causes would go down. Mm-hmm. You're more resilient to infection. You are going to live longer. You're not going to get the number 1 disease of aging called diabetes, which mm-hmm. is the precursor to cardiovascular disease and cancer and Alzheimer's. And frankly, those 3 things or those 4 things are what's likely to take you out. But gee, skipping breakfast, really? Was it that easy? There's probably some other variables, but is it the biggest variable? Yeah. And if you do it without being hungry, win. So that's why it's worth the thousands of hours of pain and late nights it takes to write a good book. But I thought it was worth sharing that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's such an interesting story and such a big problem, to your point, right? I actually spent, my career kind of working on this diabetes and metabolic syndrome spectrum issue, and just throwing out some numbers that might shock some people. 88% of Americans have some metabolic abnormality, right? Whether it's high blood sugar, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, or dyslipidemia. 70% of Americans are either overweight or obese. Approximately 50% of people have elevated blood sugar levels, whether they're pre-diabetic or diabetic. 37% are pre-diabetic, 12% approximately are diabetic. So it's literally the first time in human history where if you have normal blood sugar levels, you are in the minority. It's literally, if you're healthy, you're in the minority of people, which is a very sad sort of fact. And so I think it's a really pivotal moment for our society to be like, look, we as a society in general are unfortunately very unhealthy. And we need to, return to some traditional, techniques and ways, because certainly a lot of this only happened in the last generation or so. The rates of obesity and diabetes skyrocketed, in fact, over the course of the last few decades. So it's been a very rapid change. Obviously, a lot of that is due to big food, ultra processed food, which we have never, experienced before. As you mentioned, omega-6s, like the use of refined seed oils in cooking has never been done because they didn't exist 1 or 2 generations ago. People just sort of used butter or lard or sort of, traditional cooking oils. So yeah, I think there's a huge need. And I think because of that, techniques like fasting, which I'm super excited to deep dive with you in part 2 of this podcast, can hopefully return us to a sense of normalcy and a sense of health that I think has unfortunately been missing.